Hi, so here's the second of your two lectures for Friday, May 24th. And now I'm going to talk about how American women, women from the United States of America, which I'll refer to as American women here moving forward, really began their trajectory of doing athletic events, the recreational behaviors, how that started in the United States of America for American women, and then how it all sort of started to snowball from these initial precedents. These are all occurring in the mid to late 1800s. And most of them are from the influences that I just referred to in the previous lecture. So what was developing in Europe over the centuries prior to this time and this movement in America, and how what they were doing recreationally and sporting activity wise influenced what American women were doing in the mid to late 1800s. So we're going to start, before I start that though, I do want to just add to your first inquiry forum and ask you to think about and to respond to these questions I'm about to pose to you here. And I want you to think about, up to this point, what are the messages so far about women recreationally from ancient times through the the European early modern influences, the Victorian era. What trends were common in how women recreated? What have you heard about how women competed up to this point? So essentially, what has been sort of the foundation or groundwork laid for what seems to be more of a female approach to activity, recreation, sporting habits. And I also want you to think about what, as we are starting to talk about American women and their behaviors in sports and activities, what I want you to also think about and answer through this kind of first series of information is what are the obstacles women faced when they started to become active and have active lifestyles? What are some of the things you see, read or are hearing or see in the PowerPoints that you can tell were early obstacles for women in terms of what they wanted to do and what they were allowed to participate in, or how easy it was for them to participate in certain activities. So these are the couple questions I want you to add to your inquiry forum. The first one will be posted next week for you to submit your responses to these inquiries, and then add your own inquiry to me about questions you might have on the topics we've covered so far. So as we talk about American precedents, this is the last part of your slideshow and the rest of the readings that you have done for this week. We want to definitely talk about, first and foremost, how popular it was for women to participate in lawn games, particularly croquet and tennis. And croquet, as I had mentioned in the previous lecture, was something that had formulated in Europe and has European roots. It had been around to the time when they started participating in it in the United States for about 100 years. Its antecedents had extended back many years before it came to America and was enjoyed by Americans, both men and women. Because when croquet was introduced to America in the late 1860s and early 1870s, in Brooklyn, it was first taken up by high society folks, and it was actually very popular for men and women to compete or to engage in it together. And so it became a very popular sport or activity, hobby, that women participated in alongside of men, which was, just fairly novel. It really became very mandatory for every estate in this high society lifestyle to have a croquet set, and then it started to become common for leaders in the public sphere to provide croquet sets for the public parks for the people in the community to participate in. It was very easy to set up because it was played on grass, and women could play no matter what, the traditional garb they were wearing. But it became very distasteful, and and fell sort of in disdain because there were a lot because of the mixed genders, and people started to gamble on croquet matches, and that obviously became very troublesome for people. It actually developed a really unsavory reputation, which seems kind of comical to us, right? We think about croquet and like, how does that have something with an unsavory reputation? But the fact of the matter is that it became something where people were engaging in very, like, taking in a lot of alcohol when they were participating. They were gambling on outcomes, and it just became really, like, the philandering that became about around that event became made it very distasteful for people to participate in. So that was kind of at the same time where tennis became very popular. This was sort of the late 1870s when tennis surged as in popularity and became very, very commonplace or very popular for women to become a part of. Lawn tennis was actually introduced to the United States of America, and for women specifically, by a woman named Mary Outerbridge, and that's on your PowerPoint. She's a notable name to remember because she is noted as the person to bring it to the United States after having played it, actually not in Europe, even though it was very popular in Europe, but she had played it in Bermuda. So she helped set up the first tennis club in Staten Island, and it became very normal for women to participate in tennis just alongside their male counterparts. They did play separate, the genders were separated, but in the 1880s we saw a huge growth in the women's tennis population, and in 1887 was actually the first national tennis tournament for women that was held in New York. And again, this was a sport that maintained women's ladylike ideals and their dress. They didn't have to wear anything special to participate in this sport, and so it did become a sport that was very doable for women to participate in, and the growth of it was really high because of how popular of an activity it was. That was still individual, but had a level of competition that was different because they did host tournaments for women to participate in. It was different from croquet because women could compete against women. The competition felt very suitable. So it was really popular. It became very common for women to participate in tennis. And again, it also grew in terms of popularity because of the decline of croquet. And more communities were building tennis courts that women had access to, which made it also something very accommodating for women. So a couple other individual type sports that I want to talk about, or a few other, would be archery, pedestrianism, and golf. So these are the three other ones alongside of tennis and croquet that really had a huge following and a huge participation rate by women, and kind of set that early American precedent of women starting to be engaged in recreational activities, sporting activity, competitive environments, and these are the activities that we first most look to as the starting point for women in America and their relationship with sport. So archery then in the late 19th century, the late 19th century, women participated in archery, and you can see from your PowerPoint that the first championship for women's archery was held actually before the first national championship in tennis, and it was held by the National Archery Association. Again, this was a sport that was considered still ladylike because they didn't have to really overly exert themselves to perform the skill of archery, and so it was really quite normal to see women in their normal, natural, like daily attire to go to the archery range and participate in archery. When they held that first national archery championship, 20 women participated. They actually each had to shoot 2 rounds of 24 arrows standing at 50 yards, and then 2 rounds at 50 yards from the target, and then 48 arrows standing at 60 yards away from their target. So 50 yards, by the way, is about 150 feet. So if you're not quite sure, like that's pretty significant distance. A pretty significant distance to the target. And so women were, this is the first site that we had of women being very disciplined and having great accuracy. And so it was definitely a sport that women enjoyed doing. Again, not a lot of, still very individual, right? Not a lot of exertion that was required, not very like strenuous on the participants. And so again, considered pretty ladylike. Pedestrianism does have strong English roots, specifically. It was actually adopted over here in America in the earlier 19th century, so this was a little bit earlier precedent compared to croquet, tennis, archery, golf. But it really started to spread and grow at the same time as all these other sports did, because women started recognizing like, hey, I can do these activities. I can be proud to do them, and hey, even I can compete against other people in them. And so in many cases, exceptional pedestrianism would come into a community, and it would present challenges for the best pedestrians to compete against one another. Typically the matches covered any kind of distance from a quarter mile to 30 miles. And a lot of times they drew great crowds to the races to watch these walkers walk. This is a lot like speed walking that we know today, like the Olympic competition of speed walking. It's a very similar sport. We call it pedestrianism back in the day. Today they call it speed walking. So one of the things about this, much like boxing and then strong women, is that women started figuring out that they could cash in on this skill of pedestrianism. And so in the late 1870s, we started to see women really starting to train for their races, and then participate in these competitions where they would actually win a prize money for winning the races. So one of the most infamous racers of all time, pedestrian racers, is a woman that's in your PowerPoint. There's a picture of her there, Madame Ada Anderson. She walked 3,000 quarter miles in 3,000 quarter hours. And during those 3,000 quarter hours, she never rested more than 10 minutes at a time, because it took her a month to complete the task, and walking that quarter mile in 3,000 quarter hours. And those 3,000 quarter miles in 3,000 quarter hours. And it took her a month to complete the task, like I said. And in her last quarter mile, she finished it in 2 minutes and 38 seconds. What an amazing physical feat. It became a huge spectator event. She realized, her and her husband realized, like, hey, we can make some money off of this spectacle, essentially, because it's what it became. And they basically, her and her husband basically profited about $10,000. Now think about this in the late 1870s, early 1880s, like $10,000 they profited off of her walking 3,000 quarter miles in 3,000 quarter hours. And that really did sort of create this environment where women would then compete in these races for, like I said, a cash prize. It did definitely become a space where promoters started to market it as something that was kind of erotic, because you would go and these women were actually wearing a little less than their normal attire, and you get to see these women walking, right, obviously very aggressively, so moving their body, walking very fast, a lot of leg action. This was really interesting, but it became an event that was rather touted as or highlighted as more erotic than it was athletic. And so then we started seeing gamblers participating again, right? Like trying to decide which racer was going to finish first. So it became, again, like another image for women where they were put on display for their or for their physical beauty as opposed to their physical strength and ability. And while some of the top female walkers really still wanted to use pedestrianism as a symbol of sort of heroism, independence, in their own womanhood, unfortunately got taken over by marketers who made it into something more erotic than athletic, and it became something that lost sort of its initial interest and speed at which it was building. It lost that really fairly quickly because of what happened with how it was being promoted, and again became very unsavory for people, and no one liked when women were exploited. I mean, that's not what people like in general. The public did not like when women were exploited, and that's exactly what was happening in this venue. And so it became it sort of died down almost as quickly as it built up. And then women started participating, and because of the rise of these other activities like tennis and golf, and even archery, that these women were like, you know what, we can do these other activities where we're not put on display in the same way. So save for the opportunity that Ada Anderson created for some women and really for herself, we definitely saw that the other activities and these other sports then started to become much more popular. And golf is the last one that I want to talk about, because golf was something that was definitely brought to America from Europe, specifically from England. And it's really actually honestly kind of cool to see how America was much more progressive about the sport and their attitude towards women in the sport than their European ancestors. It came over in the late 1800s, and in 1891, so in the early 1890s, there was a club in Long Island that allowed women to play, and actually it became so popular that they made a 9-hole course specifically for women. So originally when this course was opened in Long Island, they were happy to allow women to come and play on the course, but then it became so popular for women, they actually created their own 9-hole course just for women. So they had a men's course and a women's course. A few years later in Morristown, New Jersey, we saw the first U.S. Open women's golf tournament, and it was a 7-hole competition, so it wasn't quite like the normal 18-hole competitions, multiple day competitions that we see today, but it was a competition held specifically for women. It was an open invitation for women across the United States to come and participate, and they enjoyed the opportunity to participate in that golf experience. So the next person I want to specifically highlight for you, and there's a couple people now that I want to kind of highlight for you, outside of Mary Outerbridge and Madame Ada Anderson, is Eleanor Sears. Eleanor Sears is probably the first multi-talented athlete. You can see on the slide how she participated in a ton of variety of activities. She was a marathon walker, she swam, she showed horses, she played polo, which was very uncommon for women back in the day, if for no other reason because you wore shorts, and that was just what, women don't do that, right? She played baseball, tennis, squash, field hockey, she raced cars, she flew planes. Over her lifetime, she amassed 240 trophies in this variety of sports. And so she's really considered the first multi-sport talented female athlete documented that we know on record. So she's definitely a notable woman to admire. And then the next two women are women who wrote books, sort of along the same lines of Dame Juliana Berners, and writing instructional manuals. Both Frances Willard and Catherine Beecher were women who wrote books, encouraging women to engage in these activities that are not just reserved for men, but maybe even, but also are capable for women. Women are capable of participating in, but also maybe even more seemingly appropriate for women. riding the bicycle. Frances Willard wrote a book called A Wheel Within a Wheel, How I Learned to Ride the Bicycle. And she wrote this book based on her ability to have taught herself how to ride a bike. There's some really excellent passages from the book that I just love, and typically when I host class, I read some of the passages from the book because they're really interesting, because they're not just about like learning to ride the bike, but they're motivation and inspiration to women to grab onto their own independence and really learn to like love themselves and free themselves through teaching themselves how to ride the bicycle. So it's a really great, phenomenal book that we do highlight. And actually, one of the things that I love about Frances Willard's book and her encouragement of women to ride the bicycle is that Susan B. Anthony once stated, I have the quote here, the bicycle did more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. And Susan B. Anthony, being the social reformer and feminist that she was, I mean, she led the suffragette movement, right? This is a huge statement by her, that the bicycle did more to emancipate women than anything else. Because what the bicycle did was gave women freedom, gave them independence, allowed them to make decisions for themselves on how they wanted to move from point A to point B, but also it influenced a whole new revolution in fashion, because it was much more comfortable and appropriate for women to wear shorts, not the corset and the big dress. And so with that, women pretty much tossed aside that attire and went for bloomers and that were developed by Amelia Bloomer. And this became a whole new fashion revolution, and it was all instigated by Frances Willard's insistence that women learn how to ride the bike and use the bike for their own means. So a pretty amazing accomplishment by Frances Willard. And then Catherine Beecher, she wrote the Physiology and Calisthenics for Schools and Families. And you can see here that there's some images on your PowerPoint of excerpts from the book on showing women how to do calisthenics. Catherine Beecher was a physical education instructor and a calisthenic instructor, and she really sort of encouraged women to be healthy and happy. Be healthy, therefore being happy. It would help make their home more happy and healthy as well. And so that was actually a big instruction manual that was pretty important for women, and a huge sort of realization for women. And then the last couple of slides, I'm actually going to do in one last lecture for you, lecture video for you. So check that last lecture video out. It will be a short one, but it'll be about women's college programs, and then the sort of like blooming, busting emergence of team sports in the United States of America for women, specifically in the late 19th century. So one last little video of that, and you'll have this week's material covered.